Hey, good. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Good. Nice to meet you. I am sitting in the sun. This is not. Let me.
I mean, I can see you okay. I know I've got a little bit of a weird thing going on with with my window as well. So are you a
Yeah,
volunteer with this Yeah. Are you a volunteer with this organization? Okay.
I am on the board, so that's why I kind of moderating this event. I'm just trying to figure out this one thing. I'm not sure how to turn off the video for non-host. I um thought that was already done, but I'm a little bit. Hold on, let's see. Do you know how to do that?
I don't. So and when you say non-host, do you mean like for yourself? Is that what you're referring to?
No, I think I'd like for us both to be on video and then everyone else to kind of just be kind of like a webinar.
Yeah. So I think it depends on what type of Zoom account you're using right now, because there's one that's like presenter mode. And my understanding is that if you're using that mode, then, it'll limit the visibility only to the people who you want to be presenting. Okay. The other thing that could be done is for people to maybe, if that's not how this is set up, they might have to pin, the speaker's video. So that way it always.
Yeah, that's a good, there we go. So that's you. And then I can also pin myself. There we go. Thank you with that.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good solution. If anyone else comes on, I'll just mute them or take them off video.
Right. Okay.
I'm gonna wait, and you're able to share your screen, right, Tejas?
Yeah. Let me just get the PowerPoint pulled up, and then I'll attempt to share my screen.
No, the sun is just really not working out here. Okay. We have a few folks in the waiting room.
Perfect. For this document to load. Okay, great.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking this on and helping us put this on. I know there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of folks eager to get guidance on this sort of stuff. As always, it's information.
Absolutely. So absolutely. Happy to do it. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen right now. Okay, great.
Great. Okay, perfect. I think towards the beginning, Tejas, we may just keep the presentation off. I'm going to introduce you, and then we might just share your screen after that, if that works.
That sounds good.
Perfect.
That way we know it works.
For Betty to join. I'm going to start admitting people.
Take your time.
Right. All right, for people just joining in, I think we'll wait a couple minutes to let other folks to come in, and just hang on tight, and then we'll start as soon as we can. Thank you for joining us today. Hi, Vedihi.
Hello. Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are.
Depending on where you're at, yeah. Tejas, you're joining us from the East Coast?
I'm actually in Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. So
Extremely
Central
cold
Time.
here.
I'm out here sitting in the sun in California, so.
Oh, good for you. I'm jealous.
Rub it in a little more.
Can't rub it in at all. Okay. I think we'll get just 2 more minutes and then get the ball rolling.
Jyotika, do you want me to record or do you want to record it? Oh, you're already recording it.
Yeah, you can, honestly, I'm just gonna click admit all, so it's letting people in slowly. Vaidehi, are you able to let people in from the waiting room?
No, I think you have to make me.
I made you a co-host.
Okay. I don't see anybody in the waiting room right now.
There's no one. If there is anyone that pops up, just.
Oh,
do you
I'm
see-
able to. Yeah, I did that. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. So we'll get that going. And I think we'll start with the intros and stuff. So I'll quickly introduce myself, and Vaidehi, maybe you can too. My name is Jyotika. I'm on the board of NAAIS, work in fundraising and finance, and work separately on a professional level in impact investing in San Francisco. I'm also an international student on STEM, so very interested in learning more from Tejas. Vaidehi, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. My name is Vaidehi Dongre. I am also a board member at NAAIS. I actually work for the New Zealand government in their trade commission. But in the past, I worked at Mars and just changed coasts from New York City to San Francisco. So,
yeah. Okay, then without further ado, I think we'll get started here. So thank you everyone for joining us today as we discuss the new STEM guidelines and their impact on you. I want to take a second to thank our partners, Barnes and Thornburg, for hosting this event with us. As you may know, about a week ago, the DHS announced that 22 new fields of study have been added to the STEM OPT program, allowing an increasing number of F1 students to work in their field of study post-graduation. And there's a lot of details we have to discuss here today, but before we dive in and I introduce Tejas, just a few housekeeping items. You should be on mute because I have muted all of you. So we'll just, for the sake of for the presentation, we'll have everyone on mute, but our chat is open. So as you have questions, please populate our chat, and towards the end, we'll save some time for Q&A. As a reminder, you're also being recorded. We want to make sure we're able to make this presentation available to whoever cannot attend with us today. So just a reminder that that's happening. Yep, so that's the housekeeping stuff. I want to go ahead and introduce Tejas, who has kindly agreed to do this session with us, and something that we really appreciate. So Tejas Shah is a partner at Barnes and Thornburg in Chicago, where he practices immigration law. The breadth of Tejas' practice covers a wide range of business and family-based immigration categories, as well as federal litigation, HR compliance training, internal audits, and representation of employers and individuals in adverse proceedings involving multiple federal agencies. He also works with individuals, including entrepreneurs and employees. Tejas has experience representing applicants for national interest waivers, classification as persons of extraordinary ability, and an O1 visa application. He also works with entrepreneurs seeking benefits under the International Entrepreneur Parole program. So thank you again, Tejas. And I'll pass it on to you if you want to add anything to your introduction or just get us started on the presentation.
No, thanks, Jyotika, for that introduction, and thanks, Vaidehi, for the opportunity. I'm happy to just get started. There's a lot to cover. I'm going to go ahead and just sort of do this Zoom thing. I'm not the greatest expert with technology, but I think if I do spotlight for everyone, that will ensure that I'm more visible. And it's not that I want you to see me and my beard, it's that I'm going to be sharing my screen and I want to make sure it's clearly visible for everybody. So I'm excited to be here. You know, it feels like the last 5 years, you know, all we've been doing is sharing really bad news about US immigration. And, you know, although the news that came out on Friday was not the same as, you know, what we really want to see, which is a you know, immigration reform bill that really changes US immigration in more significant ways. It was a good, you know, modest step that I think is going to be beneficial to folks with STEM degrees and entrepreneurs. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started with this presentation. Just a second here. That should, hopefully you can all see my screen now. Okay, great. All right. Primarily what I want to focus on today is, you know, going through sort of the key topics that were included in, you know, this change. And so really divided it up into 4 sections. You know, the first thing is that, you know, as Jyotika just mentioned, there are 22 new degree fields that are now eligible for the STEM OPT extension. And those additions essentially become effective immediately. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can find out if your degree is eligible for the STEM OPT extension. And then, of course, I'm sure some people here have questions about whether, you know, if they're on a particular track that's not STEM OPT eligible, you know, could they make a change that would make it STEM OPT eligible? We are also, well, what I should add there before moving on quickly is that a key thing to be aware of is that DHS has also created a process whereby you can ask that a particular field be added to the qualifying STEM program list. And that's new because I'm not aware of any changes that were made since you know, the STEM OPT list was first announced or promulgated. And so the fact that there's a process for adding is good. Of course, you know, there could also therefore be deletions to the extent that you know, policymakers decide that a particular major is no longer eligible for the STEM OPT, but you know, we'll look at it positively. Another really important development last Friday that I'm very excited about is that DHS, and when I say DHS, remember I'm talking about Department of Homeland Security. That is the parent agency for US citizenship and immigration services. So all of you are probably used to dealing with or thinking about USCIS, or you're thinking about ICE, or you're thinking about CBP. You know, ICE is the folks that are responsible for CVIS and SEVP. CBP are the folks at the airport who inspect your visa and admit you. All of them, all these different agencies are a part of DHS. DHS is the larger agency that includes all of them. So when I use DHS, I'm essentially referring to USCIS in this context. So DHS spelled out very clearly, much more clearly, on Friday through memos and policy manual updates, how entrepreneurs and STEM graduates may be able to demonstrate their eligibility for an O1 temporary visa or to apply for permanent residency based on a national interest waiver, also known as an NIW. We're going to talk about that a little bit more momentarily. But that's really, it's a pretty important development because, as we'll discuss, you know, to date, to the extent that you wanted to argue that an entrepreneur was eligible for permanent residency in the national interest waiver category, you were really relying on common sense arguments and making arguments that were tied to, you know, analogies that we ourselves were trying to draw. The fact that they more clearly spelled out the agency's position is really helpful because it also means that, you know, you can draw upon that specific guidance that DHS itself has put out there and makes those cases a little bit stronger. So more to come on that. And the other big change is that the Department of State has made J1 scholars eligible for a 36-month practical training period. And so this really refers to folks who are here on a J1 and are doing a degree program that is pre-PhD, so a bachelor's or master's. Previously, they would be eligible for 18 months of practical training, and then, under certain circumstances, they could get more. This particular development basically makes it so that they can, automatically qualify for this 36-month practical training, which is very similar to what anyone with STEM OPT or STEM OPT is able to get as well. So I know this is really grainy, and I won't necessarily go into, read them off the list, but this is the list of new STEM fields. The ones that I found particularly notable were data science, generally data analytics, general business analytics, data visualization, financial analytics, and data analytics, other. And I say that because I'm seeing more and more employers sponsoring people for visas with this type of degree and for positions involving this field. It seems to have become a really, really hot field and a very in-demand field as more and more employers are dealing with big data and they're trying to derive insights from it. So, I think it's just catching up with what the substance of these degree programs actually include. But that's pretty notable to me. If you are wondering whether your degree is STEM eligible, note that you can always look at ICE's designated degree program list for STEM occupations. I've given you the URL here, but you can always Google for this as well. Important point to remember, because, unfortunately, there are from time to time changes in the accreditation of institutions. It's not enough for, the degree to be on the designated degree program list. You also have to receive the degree from an institution that was accredited by SEVP, Student Exchange and Visitor Program, and accredited by an agency recognized by the Department of Education. And those things need to be true when you submit the STEM OPT request. So I've worked with folks in the past who gained a qualifying degree from an institution that was accredited at the time when they got the degree, but all of a sudden the rug got pulled out from underneath them by the time it was their opportunity to apply for STEM OPT, and they became ineligible because the institution was no longer on the designated or on the recognized list. I think that's outcome is not very likely with most well-established educational institutions, but you want to be mindful of where you're choosing to go to school, especially because I know that a lot of people will end up, if they don't get selected in the H-1B lottery, they'll end up considering enrolling in a CPT program or something of that nature. And some of those programs can be really fly-by-night programs that, are not necessarily looking out for your best interest. So I would strongly encourage you to give careful consideration to whether it's a good program for you to be enrolled in. So there's a couple of questions that I've seen about specific degree programs and whether, or majors, and whether they would be eligible for the STEM OPT extension. I think the question, I think you'd have to start by looking at the chip code on the CIP code on your I-20. Look at that chip code and compare that to the existing chip codes that are approved and the ones that they've approved, that they just approved, the 22 new programs. That's where I would start. If it's close enough, it might be worth having a question. It might be worth having a conversation with your university about whether, it'd be easy to sort of transition from a non-designated degree, a major that's not designated for the STEM OPT, to one that is approved. One other question, and I'm going to deal with more of these later, but I just wanted to kind of deal with them as they came in to the extent that they're relevant. Under the new STEM OPT guidelines, do companies still have to be registered on the E-Verify system? The answer is yes. None of that has changed. You still have to get a job with an E-Verify employer. You also need to ensure that you are completing a form I-983, the mentorship and training plan. So all of that needs to be done in order to qualify. It's not changing any of those underlying requirements. It's simply adding new majors to the designated degree program. I know there's lots of other questions, so we will come back to them in the section for Q&A, I promise. So STEM and O1 eligibility. So this is a big change that I briefly mentioned. So let's talk a little bit about what the O1 visa represents first and foremost. So the O1 visa is reserved for individuals of extraordinary ability, which sounds a little bit of a higher standard than it probably is, but I mean, it's meant to be for people who are a big deal, whether they are in actuality or, they just simply consider themselves to be a big deal. But it's really the language that's used in the implementing statute is that the person has to be the recipient of sustained national or international acclaim. And then they have to meet at least 3 of the criteria that, we're going to get to. It's on the next page. Key details about the O1, to the extent that you're not familiar with it, it is not subject to a quota. So there's not a limitation on the number of visas like you see with the H-1B. There's no prevailing wage, meaning that there isn't a limitation on, or a minimum salary that has to be paid. It does require a US employer acting as a sponsor. So you as an individual cannot go out there and say, well, I'm going to apply for an O1 visa on my own. Now, there are certain circumstances in which people find agents for their O1s. If an employer says, hey, I'm willing to, I need you on a part-time basis, and you have a couple of different projects lined up, there might be some creativity around hiring an agent who acts as the sponsor for the O1. And so that it doesn't always have to be a traditional employer-employee relationship. But those situations are somewhat unique. And in most cases, it's going to be a more traditional, employment relationship with a single employer. O1 visas are available to individuals in a wide range of professions. So business, arts, science, athletics, education, which means that it covers a lot of different professions. Now, the criteria for O1 eligibility are listed here. And I'm just going to briefly go through them so you have an opportunity to become familiar with them. So it includes receipt of lesser nationally and internationally recognized prizes or awards for excellence in the field of endeavor. So let's start with this premise that if you have a Nobel Prize or a Grammy, boom, you're done. You're going to qualify for an O1. You don't need anything else. 99.99% of the world doesn't meet that criteria. So when they talk about receipt of lesser nationally and internationally recognized prizes or awards, they're talking about, awards such as, you competed in some scientific competition and received an award there. Maybe, you were recognized for a paper that you wrote and received some sort of award for that paper. Now, they are going to want to know that the prize or award that you received was one that was generally open, as opposed to merely sort of an academic award, that, let's say, only individuals from your university were eligible for. So there's a good amount of, work that needs to be done to evaluate whether it's going to meet that criteria, but that is the type of evidence that they're referring to there. Membership in associations in the field which require outstanding achievements of their members as judged by experts in the field. So I think the key premise that you can remember here is that if it's a membership that you get simply by paying a fee, hey, I paid $100 and I got into this academic fraternity, that's not what they're talking about. What they are referring to is a membership and association where, there's experts or peers who judge whether you've achieved a level of excellence that, sort of makes it such that you deserve to become a member of that association. Just bear in mind what it does and does not cover. Publish materials about the individual in professional or major trade publications. So this is one that can apply particularly to STEM workers who, let's say, are working at a startup. If you work at a startup that's made some sort of significant achievement, come up with something new, creative, and there's published materials about that startup and their contributions, if you can provide evidence to show that you played a key role in whatever that achievement was that was the subject of those published materials, you may be able to meet this criteria. Participation either individually or as a part of a panel or as a judge of a work of others in the field. And so here, what we're often referring to in the scientific context is individuals who, let's say, are asked to review manuscripts for journals pre-publication. That's very common for people who are, obtaining their PhDs and have to publish their work. Or you served on an academic advisory council, reviewed somebody's dissertation, or, in some way, shape, or form, you were reviewing the work of your peers. Original scientific, scholarly, artistic, athletic, or business-related contributions of major significance. That is in some way self-explanatory. Really, you have to be able to show that you did something original in the field, And the good news here is that it is very broad, right? It can cover lots of different fields. You introduced, you came up with some really creative coaching ideas. You contributed something very, very significant to your business and to the field that people, have benefited from and are still talking about. In the scholarly context, it's if you have a lot of published work and you can show that people have relied on your publications, that's an argument that you may be able to make. The next criteria is pretty similar, authorship of scholarly articles in the field. And this is one that most commonly you'll see with researchers who are publishing, studies on various topics. But given the language and given the way this particular prong has been written, it can cover not only scientific publications, but it can cover a lot of different things. If you're somebody who writes on political science or economics or, published, an econometric analysis of something, that could be covered as well. Serving in a critical or essential capacity for organizations or establishments that have a distinguished reputation. I'm going to come back to this one on the next slide because we're going to talk a little bit more about application of all of this to STEM workers and to entrepreneurs. And then we're going to do the same thing with the next criteria, which is commanding a high salary or other significantly high remuneration for services. I'm going to take a quick look at the questions. Okay, so we have a couple of questions related to O1s. So one of them is, can city governments apply and sponsor an individual for an O1? The answer is yes. Every US employer can apply and sponsor an individual for an O1. One, sort of benefit, I suppose you could consider for yourself of an O1 compared to some other visa categories is that unlike an H-1B where federal law requires the employer to cover the costs associated with an H-1B, with an O1, there is no such restriction. So if you had an employer that was otherwise willing and said, look, we like you, we want to sponsor you, but we are a city government, we're a nonprofit, we don't have the budget for, paying for the filing and legal fees associated with a visa like this. The way you could potentially work around that is, the fact that you could pay for it if you wanted to. The only role that the employer would then play in that situation would be that they are acting as a sponsor and signing the paperwork for the O1 visa and basically saying that, yes, we're offering this person a job offer and it's consistent with what's listed on this application. We also have a question, what exactly is the benefit of having an O1 visa? Well, I think that the O1, I don't want to call it a fallback to the H-1B because it's more than that. But for a lot of folks, given how difficult it's been to get an H-1B visa of late with the 30-odd% selection rate that we saw most recently, having another option is really, really important. Unlike the H-1B, the O1 also doesn't have any limitation on the number of years you can spend on the O1. So it's 3 years at a time, but it can be extended indefinitely. From an employer standpoint, it can be a good category because there is no prevailing wage requirement. And so, particularly in certain fields, it can be where maybe it's more bonus-based or commission-based or something like that. That could be helpful. It's just a really important avenue that's available where, you simply can't go the H-1B route for whatever reason. It also note here that, obviously for somebody who is in a STEM field, they're likely to have the degrees, but for some fields where degrees are not necessarily important, there's no reference to needing to have a degree in the O1 context, whereas with an H-1B, there's a particular educational requirement that has to be met. So those are all benefits of the O1 to be thinking about. Now, USCIS made this O1 announcement last Friday. And what was notable about this is that it specifically identified several examples of evidence that STEM graduates and entrepreneurs can provide for O1 eligibility. Now, to be clear, individuals have been applying for O1 visas as entrepreneurs, for several years now, even though USCIS hadn't necessarily indicated that they could do so. You make the best arguments you can. But what's notable about this is that you have something that you can specifically hang your hat on and say, look, you've said that somebody can meet this prong by doing X. Look, that's exactly what I'm showing you. And it makes it so that it becomes that much easier to secure approval of this application. And what's interesting about this, the timing of this announcement, is that it's a month and a half before the H-1B lottery. And the indications are that the administration knows that there's going to be a ton of pressure on the H-1B lottery again this year. Businesses are struggling to find, really good professional workers right now. It's in many ways an employee's market. And so they are trying to flag ways that people can try to get around the H-1B lottery with all its limitations. Now, I also want to be clear that the fact that you may be a STEM graduate doesn't automatically mean that the O1 is going to be an option for you. It's not that simple. It is a question of whether you can present evidence that's appropriate and show that you're otherwise going to be eligible. But it's an avenue that's available to potentially find another way to work in the U.S. So some key considerations that USCIS pointed out is that for startups in particular, they would be willing to look at equity that an individual holds as proof of commanding a high salary. Sorry, I pressed down too much on that. So this last prong, commanding a high salary or other significantly higher remuneration for services. Obviously, somebody who's working at a startup is going to struggle to show that they're getting paid a very, very high salary. Most startups don't do that. But if you have stock options and you can present credible evidence to show that those stock options in the business are valuable, that could be a way to meet that particular prong. Proof of outside funding. That's something that you could work in to a few of these different criteria. You might be able to argue that that proof of outside funding constitutes a lesser nationally and internationally recognized prize or award for excellence in the field of endeavor, especially if you can show that that particular source of outside funding, whether it's an angel investor or a VC, is selective, and makes very selective decisions about whom they want to sponsor for and whom they want to allocate funding to. Contribution of IP to the startup, that would support an argument that you've served in a critical or essential capacity for organizations or establishments that have a distinguished reputation, or that you've made original contributions of major significance in the field. If you are, let's say, a co-founder of a startup, and you can show that you've played a really important role in that particular entity, and it's a startup that has gained some traction, that is also evidence that you could use to support this argument that you've served in a critical or essential capacity for organizations or establishments that have a distinguished reputation. So they've given a little bit of a roadmap here for demonstrating as a STEM worker or as an entrepreneur that you can meet the O1 criteria. Now, I want to emphasize again that just because you're a STEM worker doesn't mean that you're going to qualify for an O1. You've got to be able to present credible evidence of at least 3 of these criteria and then demonstrate, that you're meeting the legal standard. But the fact that they put this together in this way and have provided this guidance is a strong indication that they do want to promote access for STEM workers, especially folks who are, playing key roles with their employers. They want to make it easier for them to get, qualify for this particular visa category. I'm sure there are more questions on this, and we'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. So the next topic that I wanted to talk about is the national interest waiver. Now, I wanted to first explain what a national interest waiver is. So typically, the most common way in which a US employer would sponsor somebody for permanent residency is by conducting a labor market test. And that's known as Perm or labor certification. So what that involves is that the employer, designs the job description and says, okay, I'm sponsoring this individual for the role of a financial analyst. They have to be very, very specific about the requirements, and they have to identify only minimum requirements. What's the very least that you would take to hire somebody into this role? You can't look at nice to have skills. You can't look at preferred skills. Then you got to do a labor market test where, you run advertisements in the newspaper, you conduct some other forms of recruitment and show that, you couldn't find a US, minimally qualified US worker for the position. The system as it's designed creates a lot of opportunities for gamesmanship, and employers are often trying to get around it because you're trying to prove a negative. If you have a foreign national that you're sponsoring for permanent residency, you already have somebody in mind. And Facebook recently got in a lot of trouble for this because they were doing some really interesting things that the US government didn't like, and they got fined a significant amount of money. But that's a separate category. And that's a category that involves, sponsorship by an employer and doing a labor market test. Now, the idea there behind the labor market test is that, there's an inherent national interest in making sure that, you quote unquote, don't bring in a bunch of foreign workers and then displace US workers from their jobs or drive down the salaries being paid to US workers. That's the sort of, theoretical basis for that particular requirement. The national interest waiver is something that's existed for 20 odd years. And it's a designation whereby Congress has said that, look, if it is in the national interest on a case-by-case basis, you can basically eliminate, in that particular case, the labor certification requirement. So you don't have to do a labor market test that's based on minimum requirements to show that there's no qualified US workers for the position. And the benefit of this is twofold. First, you don't have to have an employer for a national interest waiver. So if a particular individual just wanted to apply for permanent residency based on a national interest waiver, they could just self-apply, they could self-sponsor. And that happens all the time. And the benefit of that individual doing that is it gives them a degree of mobility. That application is still going to be viable whether they're with employer A or B or C in the future. The second benefit is that the national interest waiver allows you to subjectively argue all the special benefits that you would bring to the United States. It's not a race to the bottom, so to speak. So if there are certain special skills you have, then you can bring those to the table and make that a part of your argument. What I also want to point out, though, is that a national interest waiver is part of what's known as the Eb2 Preference category. Now, for Indians, unfortunately, for anyone born in India, the Eb2 Preference category is significantly backlogged. It's moved up a decent amount over the last year and a half because we had a large number of green cards that were available for various reasons, but it's still subject to the backlog. So it's not necessarily going to result in immediate availability of a green card. However, what you want to do is you want to be thinking about these strategies in conjunction with each other, right? So you will need a temporary visa until you get to the point where you can get your green card. That temporary visa could be an O1, or it could be an H1B, or it could be this immigrant, the Entrepreneurial Parole program that we're about to talk about momentarily as well. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind is that, if you apply for a green card in the national interest waiver category, you're establishing what's known as a priority date. And establishing the priority date basically puts you in line to get your green card. Now, in the future, if you have an opportunity to apply for a green card in a faster category, such as, let's say, the EB1 as a person of extraordinary ability, you will benefit from where you are in line with the national interest waiver and potentially thereby put you in a position where you can more or less immediately then get your green card. Now, that's a much longer conversation. I'm just trying to give you the full picture around a national interest waiver. Now, before we talk about what USCIS, what DHS, the information it gave us on Friday, I want to talk a little bit about the legal framework. So the cases interpreting how to qualify for a national interest waiver basically say that in order to qualify, you have to A, show that the proposed endeavor, meaning the work that you're going to do, has substantial merit and is of national importance. So what that means is that it's inherently a good thing, scientific research, public health research, political science research, creating job opportunities for people, coming up with a new theory of coming up with a new business idea that's going to revolutionize the market. And you have to be able to show that it has national importance. So what that refers to is impact. It's not enough to say, well, I'm a teacher at a public school. That's important because I'm educating the next generation. They're going to look at that and say, yes, we agree with you that it's of substantial merit, but it's of localized impact. You're not having a broader impact. On the other hand, if you were a teacher and you were, training other teachers throughout the country because you have special skills, or you're publishing your work on teaching somewhere, or you're doing something else where you can show some sort of national impact, then you can meet that prong. The second one is you are well positioned to advance the proposed endeavor. And so what that's referring to is that, based on your prior history, it's clear that you have some special skills that position you well to advance whatever that proposed endeavor is. And so basically you can't just say, well, I've never done anything, meaningful in this area in the past, but believe me, I'm capable of it and I'll do it. That's not enough, right? There's got to be some precedent to be able to point to in your background to say, this person's done X, therefore this person is well positioned because they have all these special skills. Finally, the next question is, the next issue is, it would be beneficial to the United States to waive the requirements of a job offer and thus the labor certification. And this is really a balancing test. And that's where, the USCIS is basically going to be looking at, what's the national interest? What's the past work you've done? How are you going to benefit the US in the future? Weighing that versus the requirements of a job offer and the labor certification. Before we move to the next slide, I want to address a couple of really good questions that just came in. So one of them is whether the NIW needs to have a sponsor as such. So no job offer is required, but do you need a sponsor? The answer is no, you don't need a sponsor because you can apply on your own. So, if you're self-sponsoring, you're applying on your own. Now, you do sort of need to demonstrate that, or at least attest to the fact that, you have the intention of working in the field. Because if you go out there and say, well, I'm an expert in biological research, and you demonstrate that, and then, your true intention is to open a restaurant and to never do research again, that's a problem. But the whole point of this particular category is to also give the flexibility to individuals to apply on their own. There's also a question about whether recent graduates from bachelor's programs in the US are eligible for the Eb2 preference categories that only for graduates from advanced degrees, master's degrees, PhDs, et cetera. So the short answer is that theoretically it is possible for individuals with bachelor's degrees to qualify because you can either be an advanced degree holder or you can be what's known as a person of exceptional ability. And it's another sort of criteria-based approach where if you meet 3 out of 5 criteria, you can be considered a person of exceptional ability. However, I will say that I think it's going to be very difficult for an individual who's a recent bachelor's degree graduate to meet any 3 of those 5 criteria. Presumably, somebody who's a recent bachelor's graduate is going to have limited, employment experience. I can't recall all the criteria right now, but as a practical matter, I think it's likely to be a little bit challenging to meet those criteria as a bachelor's degree holder alone, especially if it's one thing if, you're 10 years out or 5 years out, but if you're relatively recent, it could be a little bit more challenging. With that said, I am working with somebody right now who is a recent bachelor's degree graduate and he's on his OPT, but he is a co-founder of a startup. And we've concluded that he can meet the requirements for being considered a person of exceptional ability. So it is going to be a little bit of a case-by-case determination based on your own credentials and your background. So let's talk a little bit about what the USCIS announced regarding national interest waivers. So they emphasized the availability of these NIWs to STEM graduates. They talked about, the potential relevance and some of the evidence that I discussed regarding O1s to NIW eligibility. Now remember that the NIW doesn't require specific forms of evidence. It just has this 3-part test that's very subjective. And so it gives you a lot of room and flexibility to argue whatever you think is relevant. Hey, I've made these key scientific contributions. Hey, I'm employed in a critical capacity with this company. I've published my work. I have a patent. I have, I have a lot of stock in the company, which demonstrates that they value me tremendously. And, that's reflective of the work that I've done. It's a really subjective and malleable test, which creates a lot of room to argue, various different types of eligibility if you wanted to. Another important aspect of the announcement is that USCIS basically acknowledged that, look, if somebody's an entrepreneur, let's say that they own 10% of a startup, or, they started a business with their buddy, it may not make so much sense in that situation to go the labor certification route. Why would the business ever consider, replacing a part owner of the company? And this is important because it's another one of those things where you can say, look, inherently, it just doesn't make sense to go the labor certification route here. And here's all the other reasons why a national interest waiver should be approved. Another aspect of the announcement that is important is that it's talked specifically about the importance of US competitiveness in certain STEM fields as a relevant or urgent consideration. And so to me, what this suggests is that, look, let's take a certain field where the US knows that it really needs to bring on, hire more or generate more STEM talent. Cybersecurity is one that comes to mind. It's a critical field, and we know that there's a lot of, adversarial threats in cybersecurity. Another one that I could think of would be, let's say, quantum mechanics or quantum computing or something of that nature. And of course, they don't all, there's plenty of other fields beyond that. But those are examples of fields where you could say, hey, we really need to make sure that we have enough talent there. And so if you can demonstrate, let's say that you're employed at a company or at an institution that conducted an extensive search and was struggling to find the talent that they needed, they found you, they're willing to provide statements in support of your application, and you can provide other evidence that the field that you work in, the degree that you have, is one that's really, really valuable to the US because of sort of great power competition. The Chinese, the Russians, everyone else is trying to get a leg up in those fields. That could be really strong evidence in support of a national interest waiver argument. So it's something that you'd want to, consider presenting and consider, whether you might have a relevant application here. So I'm going to move on from the national interest waiver category and talk a little bit about the entrepreneur parole program. I think it's actually, I think I may have misstated the program. I apologize for that. It's the International Entrepreneur Parole Program, or IEP. And so this program was originally created by President Obama, Barack Obama, when he was president. He proposed it in 2015. At the time, he really wanted to get a startup visa, a visa that would specifically be for entrepreneurs who would create a startup business. They couldn't get anything through Congress, and creating a new visa program requires, the U.S. Congress. It's like the Parliament for the U.S. to pass a bill. They weren't successful in doing that. So what they did instead is that they said, okay, we're going to create this parole program. Parole doesn't require Congress to act. Parole is basically the immigration, the authority of the immigration authorities' inherent ability to say, we're going to, quote unquote, parole somebody into the US, which basically means that they're admitting them temporarily and basically granting them legal permission to enter. And so what they said is that if you meet certain criteria, we are willing to parole you into the US so that you can work on your startup. So it's not a visa, but it is like a visa. And it's a little bit confusing, but the best way to think about it is it's a legal avenue to enter the US, but it's not quite the same thing as an H-1B visa because it's not created by Congress itself. So Trump tried to kill the program, and then there were lots of lawsuits blocking him from doing that. And then as soon as Biden became president, he basically reinvigorated the program. So people are filing these applications right now, and we're starting to get decisions. And so the way this program works is that you can qualify for a 2.5-year period where you're paroled into the US, and then another 2.5-year period where that you can extend it. The eligibility requirements, I've listed them out here, but you have to have a minimum of 10% ownership of the startup. The startup needs to be relatively new, meaning it needs to have been created in the last 5 years. You need to be playing a central and active role in the startup entity. You have to be able to demonstrate that the startup has substantial potential for rapid job growth. And then you need to be able to demonstrate that there's going to be a significant public benefit to the US, which you can demonstrate through showing that there's been significant capital funding from sources such as traditional startup funders like venture capital or angel investors, or that the startup has received awards or grants for economic development, research and development, or job creation from the federal, state, or local government, or any other comparable evidence. Now, what I want to emphasize is that this is not typically going to cover a situation where your family said, hey, I'm going to support you, I'm going to give you $100,000 to start this business. I don't think that's going to be applicable. I don't think that's going to be the type of situation that we're talking about, because they really are emphasizing that it needs to be a program where you've received funding from outside sources. They don't want it to be a program that you can essentially just buy your way into through personal wealth or personal assets. There may be certain other avenues in that situation, but I don't really believe that this program is meant to do that. Now, for many people who have a shorter pathway to get a green card, oftentimes what they're going to be looking at is get into the IEP program, and during either the first 2.5-year period or the second 2.5-year period, apply for a green card through a national interest waiver, and then boom, you're sort of done with the immigration immigration conveyor belt. For folks from India who have a much longer pathway, it may require a little bit more creativity. It could be a combination of this program along with maybe eventually switching to an O1 while also getting the green card process in motion, and sort of looking at a combination of those things. So it's going to be sort of a case-by-case analysis, but I think it's important to look at these programs kind of in conjunction with each other in sum total, as opposed to looking and saying, well, if I can't get it within this 5-year period, what's the point? There's likely to be other avenues that you can also be considering after that. The last thing that I want to briefly talk about with regard to the changes that were made last Friday is the J1 Exchange Visitor Program. And the big change here is that individuals on a J1 who are enrolled in a pre-doctoral STEM program can now qualify for up to 36 months of practical training, both in 2022 and 2023. They're going to be looking at the same STEM programs that are on the designated degree program list, and they've established kind of a pathway to apply for, to get this written prior approval. Now, I have to admit, I don't spend a lot of time working with individuals on a J1. So this part of it, I think, is going to be more relevant to certain institutions that have a large number of J1s. My assumption is that a lot of you are on F1s, and so the OPT portion of it is going to be much more relevant to you. But with that, I would love to, open it up for questions. So Jyotika, I'm not sure how you wanted to do this, if you wanted to moderate or, it sounds like that's the appropriate way. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Tejas, one, thank you so much. That was all so informative and helpful. If you could stop sharing your screen, I've been kind of tracking the questions in the chat, and then We've also collected questions from other folks that aren't in this meeting. So I have a few ready, and then we can touch upon things as they come up. As a reminder for whoever is attending, please feel free to populate the chat with additional questions, and we'll keep picking them up. So thank you, everyone. I think something that you touched on a little, Tejas, but it's a recurring theme, I think, across all the questions we see is, what impact does this have on the immigration line? Does this mean an easier process to get a green card? Will it create more of a backlog for green cards? So just the impact there, I think, is something that's on the mind.
Yeah. So look, I mean, oftentimes these changes have the ironic impact of, on a macro level, making it so that more people are able to apply for green cards, which in the absence of expanding the pool, it's all supply and demand. You have more demand now and supply remains the same. So it means that the line might get a little bit longer. But for all those individuals who are now eligible and have a pathway, it's good for them. So, it can have a dual impact in the sense that there could be an individual in this webinar right now who's going to benefit individually, but everyone else may be looking at a slightly longer line because all of a sudden there could be more people who are applying for green cards. It's hard to put down a singular response to that question for that reason. But I tend to look at it and say, look, you want to make it easier for people at the end of the day to become permanent residents, especially for people who are driving creativity and have innovative ideas. And somebody who falls into that category, even if this particular category may have a longer waiting list, I'm fairly confident that as that person's situation changes and progresses, that new avenues are going to open up that will make it faster for them to get their green card.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that resonates. It's situational, and hopefully, we have hope in this current administration to make that happen for us. Yeah. So a few questions I think we received that were specifically STEM OPT focused. One is, how soon will the respective SIP or CHIP codes be updated by the universities?
So my understanding is that the changes that were made on Friday were effective immediately, meaning that those CHIP codes are now eligible for STEM OPT designation immediately. So if you're enrolled in one of those degree programs, as I understand it, based on the announcement, you should be able to get the STEM OPT extension immediately. Now, if you have a degree, or if you're on track to get a degree that is close to one of those CHIP codes, but is not covered by, the expanded degree program, by the expanded degree list, and isn't covered by, the existing STEM OPT list, you may want to have a conversation with the relevant folks at your university to determine if there's some changes you can make to get yourself into that program. Where it's just changing your major, right? And so I don't know how easy it's going to be. I think it's going to be case by case depending on the program that you're in, but it's worth exploring, I think.
I think that also goes with one of the questions we had in the chat about being a public health major, and if they can change their curriculum for it to fit.
Yeah, I don't know that you're going to be able to do it. And look, some of this stuff I'm speculating a little bit, okay, because I don't know the exact answer, and I want you to talk to your university, but I don't think you're going to necessarily make an argument by analogy to say, well, I've got a degree that's called A, it has enough of B in it, so why don't you just call that? I think they have to make the decision. Now, maybe you can advocate for that. Let's say that B is covered. Let's take data analytics as an example. Data analytics, we now know, is covered by the STEM OPT list. Let's say you have a degree that's close enough and your university doesn't offer data analytics. Can you make an argument to your university that this is so close to data analytics that you should just code it as such? Probably. I don't know what goes into making that decision at the DSO level. So I think that's going to be a conversation that you need to have with your university.
Absolutely. I'm seeing a question in the chat, which I think it may just be helpful. Tejas, if you could explain to the broader group how that STEM program works, so how OPT and then the STEM extension works and what the timeline is for that, because I see some questions around that stuff.
Sure. So everyone who graduates from the US with a bachelor's or master's or any other degree, not an associate's degree, but a minimum of a bachelor's degree, who has not already used up 12 months of full-time training. So as long as you didn't do like 12 months of full-time CPT when you were in school, can qualify for 12 months of OPT, optional practical training. All you need for OPT is proof that you have a US job offer. And during that OPT period, you can have a maximum of 90 days of unemployment and still be in status. Now, individuals who have a degree in a qualifying STEM field, so that's where the designated degree program list comes in, can qualify for an additional 24-month extension of OPT. In order to qualify for the 24-month extension, first you have to have a designated degree, meaning it falls into one of the STEM fields. Second, you have to have a job opportunity with an employer that's enrolled in E-Verify. And third, you have to complete something called a mentorship and training plan with the employer, also known as a Form I-983. You got to present that to your DSO. DSO needs to look at it and say, okay, looks good. I'm going to give you a new I-20 that recommends approval of your STEM OPT. You take that new I-20, file a new OPT request with USCIS, and you must file it by the time your existing OPT expires. If you do not file it by that date, if it arrives one day later, unfortunately, you are absolutely screwed and you've lost your opportunity. And there is no flexibility around that, sadly. So I really emphasize that because I've had the sad experience of working with people who have been screwed over in that way. FedEx got delayed, you know, or something happened and there's no flexibility whatsoever. But once you apply for that STEM OPT, as long as you filed it timely, you can now continue working even if you don't have that STEM OPT card when your existing OPT card expires for up to 180 days. So for up to 6 months, that STEM OPT card will allow you to continue working based on the fact that it's pending while the existing OPT card has expired. Again, as long as it was filed before that OPT card expired. But, you know, like I said, it's 24 months and then it expires, that STEM OPT expires at that end of that 24-month period. So you get a total of 36 months in total on OPT. Now, I know that there were some questions. So one of the questions is you absolutely need a job offer for STEM OPT, right? And broadly speaking, yes, the answer to the question that was just asked is yes. You do need a job offer for STEM OPT because you have to complete the Form 983, which requires an employer. And yes, OPT, I believe you can apply even without an offer, but then you have to be able to get the job within 90 days and then not accrue any further unemployment. There were a couple of questions about, you know, whether you can do work on the startup during your 12-month OPT, and the answer is yes. You can be self-employed during your OPT as long as you can demonstrate that it's true self-employment. And I always recommend that, you know, you set up something that is credible, you know, has some structure to it as opposed to sitting in your apartment and, you know, playing video games and saying that, you know, I'm self-employed. It's a little trickier when it comes to the STEM OPT because there has to be some sort of employment relationship for the STEM OPT because you have to attest that somebody's going to be overseeing your work. And so if you were to go the route of wanting to do your startup during the STEM OPT, I would encourage you to consider whether there are alternatives such as the Entrepreneurial Parole program or an O1. But if for whatever reason those are not alternatives, then you'd want to ensure that there's some structure to the startup, like having a board of directors or somebody else that you quote unquote report to who could be responsible for overseeing your work. We've got some, and so that sort of addresses the question about, you know, the 983. You will need to ensure that you have somebody who's overseeing your work. I'm going to just kind of, if it's okay with you, Jyotika, there's some questions, and can I answer them quick fire?
Absolutely. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Are volunteer positions qualified in OPT and STEM OPT? Volunteer positions are qualified in OPT, but not STEM OPT. You cannot get STEM OPT based on a volunteer position. After the 36-month period, do you keep extending with the OPT with the employer, or is the next stage an H-1B or O1 visa process? You will not be able to extend your OPT beyond 36 months. So you should be looking to figure out what's my transition plan throughout that 36-month period. You know, if your employer is willing to sponsor you for an H-1B, go into the lottery the first year you can be sponsored. Because as you know, it's a lottery, and simple math tells you that over a 36-month period, if you get sponsored for an H-1B 3 times, you have a greater likelihood of being selected as opposed to only being sponsored once. Should the job be full-time or part-time? In both instances, I believe it needs to be a minimum of 20 hours per week. So I'll stop there and pause for other questions.
Yeah, people keep populating the chat. I think Tejas, you've done a very good job of keeping track of our questions, and so we're getting through most of them. There's a general question here, which I'm sure everyone wants your take on, but I'm not sure if you were going to have the right answer to. Is, you know, are employers going to be more optimistic about international hires after these guidelines?
Sorry, Jyotika, you froze on me for just a moment, so I didn't hear the complete question. Could you repeat it?
No worries. The question was, are employers likely to be more optimistic about international hires post these renewed guidelines?
Look, honestly, I think it really depends on the employer, because I will tell you that I have some employers who sponsor a lot of people for visas. And I think it, to some extent, has to do with the mindset. I've noticed that companies that have an international orientation tend to already recognize the value of international talent, and they look at costs associated with immigration sponsorship as sort of just a cost of doing business. And so I have clients like that who, you know, take that approach, but some of my clients are also going to be somewhat scrutinizing about positions in which they're willing to sponsor. They're much more likely to sponsor people in STEM fields or like a computational finance role or other fields where they think it's hard to find good talent. I've worked with other clients who have said, okay, if it's going to require sponsorship, I'm not going to go there, right? And so it's you know, I think it's really hard to generalize, but when I have conversations with employers, the things that always ring true are everyone's struggling to find good STEM talent. And that's where, you know, folks on visas are often, you know, you look at like, you know, computer science folks, you look at data analysts, you look at, not analysts, but analytics, which I think is more rigorous than analysts. You look at a lot of other fields that involve advanced degrees. I feel like every third or every second person that I'm seeing come through from my clients wanting to prospectively hire is a foreign national, you know, and that just affects, you know, a high percentage of enrollment. So it varies, you know, obviously by where we are in the life cycle also. You know, I think the previous administration was very difficult to work with and maybe had an effect. But the fact that there are some more options right now is a good sign, I think, for employers also who may have been scared away because they feel like I could invest 36 months and then what's going to happen if the person doesn't get a visa. Maybe now they're willing to and say, perhaps we're going to have some more options, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, and just given my personal experience, I think a lot of it is also educating the employers. A lot of the smaller employers aren't aware of, haven't worked with too many foreign nationals, and just are a part of it, the concern or the fear is just of the unknown and just not knowing how to hire international applicants. And so to the extent that you can advocate for yourself and educate your employer on like what the steps are that you need to complete to be hired, because it's not that complicated. It doesn't have to be super complicated in STEM. That can definitely help. Okay, I want to be cognizant of time because we are over time. And we've covered a lot of questions and a lot of good material. So if there's any last or any pending questions, everyone, you can populate the chat. But if not, I want to just pass it on to you, Tejas, for maybe some closing remarks, and also want to thank you and the partnership with Barnes and Thornburg for making this happen.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. And I'm glad that everyone was here, and I hope it was useful and engaging. I would recommend also, well, I guess my closing thoughts would be stay optimistic. You know, I know it's a really difficult slog for Indian citizens in particular right now because of the green card queue. You know, my parents immigrated from India in the 70s, and it was a very, very different process, you know, back then compared to where we are now. But I feel optimistic in light of some of the movement we are seeing around these programs, you know, that sooner or later we're going to see some concrete changes that are going to make it a little bit easier for folks with advanced degrees in particular. They're interestingly, the other day, I read that the Senate had passed a bill that would make significant investments in science and technology, sort of designed to counter Chinese scientific advancement. And the House is working on its version of the bill, and apparently they inserted some provisions that would basically, you know, make it easier and eliminate the queue for individuals with advanced degrees like PhDs in STEM field apply for a green card. I thought that was really interesting, you know, and if that somehow makes its way to the final bill, that could be a really good thing for a lot of people, also because it could take, you know, certain folks out of the queue and thereby on a macro level make the process easier. So I know there's some questions regarding, you know, my email and ability to answer some questions. What I would propose is this, that so just in the interest of time, if folks are just interested in having a general workshop like this, I'm happy to, you know, perhaps set aside a little bit of time to do another general workshop like this. What gets a little bit more challenging is, you know, if there's a lot of, you know, sort of one-off questions over email, because my inbox tends to be a little bit insane. I'm happy also, of course, to schedule appointments on a, you know, with individuals who, you know, want to schedule some time. We end up then doing that through our normal law firm channels and whatnot. But I'll put my email here and I'll let you know how best I can answer any questions that are asked. But I will also make the offer that if there's enough interest and you guys are interested in doing another workshop of this nature, I am happy to, you know, work with you to set something like that up.
That's very gracious and very kind of you, Tejas. I think what we'll do on our end is you know, speak internally at NAAS about how to facilitate that and make that happen, and maybe make that a little bit more interactive than this one. This was a lot of relaying information. Perhaps the next one could be completely discussion based or Q&A oriented. So that sounds great. For folks still on, we're going to record this and send it out to NAAS members as well as whoever attended here. So all is not lost. You have the PowerPoint and you have all of Tejas's guidance that we had the pleasure to be here for today. So with that, I think, thank you again, Tejas. So great to have this happen, and hopefully we'll have another one soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much, Tejas.
Have a good evening.
Take care.
Have a great evening.
Bye.